Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am talking about my 2021 TBR, my top 10 books to read this year. And on this list I am trying to focus on adult fantasy, mostly high fantasy, some historical fantasy. I have one exception, one YA fantasy, but for the most part I'm really trying to focus on adult fantasy. That's something that I want to focus on throughout 2021, just because I feel like I haven't been reading as much adult fantasy, even though that is my favorite genre slash age range. So I wanted to make my top 10 books really focus on that as well. I also have some pretty chunky books on this list. I have the beginnings of a lot of new series that I would like to start, so I'm very excited about this. So let's just get started. First up, I actually have a book that I don't own yet. Usually I try to make this just be books that are already on my shelf, but this is an exception, which is the Rainwild Chronicles by Robin Hobb. This is the fourth series in her Realm of the Elderlings larger series, and the one series that has 4 books instead of being a trilogy, and it is the next one up after the Tawny Man trilogy. And hopefully in January I will be finishing Fool's Fate, which is the last book in the Tawny Man trilogy, and I can start the Rainwild Chronicles. Every year I have a Robin Hobb series on this list of top 10, and usually I put the entire series as like one slot on this list, and you know, for 2 of the series, that worked. It worked for the first 2, and then for the Tawny Man trilogy, it really didn't. And it has now taken me 3 years to read one trilogy for some reason. So I think I'm going to try and go easy on myself a little bit. And instead of committing to reading the entire series of the Rainwild Chronicles, I am just going to put the first 2 books to take up one spot on this list. So the list will technically be 11 books, but these 2 are kind of taking up one spot in my top 10. So I would love to read this entire series, but I am really just going to commit myself to reading 2 of them. Next up, I have another book with dragons, which is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is a high fantasy standalone, so it is pretty chunky. But I've been wanting to get to this one for a while. This, I think, is set in a fantasy world where there are dragons, and I think there are 2 like religious factions. One of them believes that dragons are meant to be feared, and one of them thinks that dragons are meant to be worshipped, and so they have these like warring religious factions. I think there is a female-female romance at the center of this. I've heard amazing things about it. I have read one other book by Samantha Shannon, which was the first book in her series, I think the Bone Season, I read a long time ago, and I didn't love it. I didn't hate it, I just was like not that into it. But that is more like dystopian, and this is high fantasy, and so I'm definitely willing to give her another shot as an author, and I'm really excited to see what I think of this one because I've heard so much about it, and it's very chunky, so that's gonna be exciting. Speaking of chunky books, I have 2 more that are pretty chunky. One of them is The Broken Crown by Michelle West. I am hoping to read this early in the year because this is actually, I think, also on my winter TBR, but I really want to make sure I get to it, so I'm putting it on just like all the TBRs. So this is the start to a fantasy series, and on the cover it says, "Dominion and Empire. Would she prove a helpless prize in their games of power, or the most cunning player of them all?" So I think that this is going to be very political and have a lot of like rivalries, and I think there are people who are essentially fighting over like the throne and also trying to get a hold of the Sun Sword, which I think is like a magical sword of some sort. At this point, I've really forgotten what this book is about, but I really want to get to it, and I want to try it. And I mean, this is a little mass market paperback, but this is almost 800 pages, so this is another chunky one. And then my other chunky mass market that I really want to get to this year is Cushiols Dart by Jacqueline Carey. I just recently hauled this one, and I really want to get to this one because I have seen it on shelves for so long and just been meaning to read it for a long time. And it's also one that I always see recommended for if you like, you know, the Seven Water series. This one's recommended. I don't necessarily think that they're going to be similar from what I know. This seems like it's going to be very different in content, in vibe, in story and characters and everything, but for some reason this is always recommended as like, if you like Seven Waters, then you should also try this. So I want to give it a try. And in this one, our main character, Phaedra, is a indentured servant who has been trained as a courtesan and a spy. And so I think this is going to be very political. And I also think there's probably going to be a lot of spying and a lot of seducing people, I'm assuming, if she's a courtesan. I don't know. But I'm really interested in trying this, and I'm hoping to get into this series and this author. And this is another little paperback this one's 900 pages. So this series, the books in this series are quite chunky. Then next up I have Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor, and this is one I've been wanting to get to for a while. I actually started this in 2020 and then I ended up getting distracted and putting it down, but I really want to get back to it and I want to prioritize making sure I read this in 2021. I got about like 80 pages into it, so a good little chunk into it. This one is set in a post-apocalyptic Africa, and the main character that we are following is born from a violent rape, and so she is expected to live a life of violence, but she starts to develop some magical powers and then discovers that there is some other magical being who is now trying to kill her. So this is going to be a very intense read. From the first like 80 pages that I read, it was already a very intense read, but I do really want to get back to this and finish it in 2021. Next up, I have Daughters of the Storm by Kim Wilkins. This is the beginning of a fantasy trilogy, and in this we are following 5 sisters, and they are all the daughters of a king, but at the beginning of the story, the king is sick and possibly dying, and I think it's their stepbrother is essentially trying to take over the country and get rid of their father. And so these 5 sisters, who are all extremely different from each other, have to figure out how to work together to save their father and their country. So I haven't really heard a lot about this book, but I have been wanting to read it for a while, so hopefully I will get to it in 2021. Then I have The Story of Silence by Alex Myers. I just recently hauled this one and I'm very excited about it. This, I think, is like historical fantasy. It is set, I think, in medieval Cornwall, but it's based on a French legend. And in this, there's a king who has decreed that women cannot inherit. And so when an earl has a daughter, he decides to disguise her as his son so that his child can still inherit. And that child's name is Silence, hence The Story of Silence. And so this is about Silence kind of growing up and figuring out themselves and their life, and I'm assuming their gender, and I think that this is going to talk a lot about gender and like gender norms and expectations, especially in this like historical context. But also I just feel like this has a lot of things about it that I would love. It's set, I think, in medieval Cornwall. I think Merlin is in it. There may or may not be dragons. There are going to be knights. I just feel like I'm going to love this one, and I'm especially excited about it. Then I have Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is a standalone fantasy. I've been wanting to try this author for a while because I always hear really great things about his writing, his world building, his character work, all of these things, which are all things that are important to me in a book. So I just hear incredible things about Guy Gavriel Kay. I've been meaning to try him for a while. This one, I don't really remember what the plot is, but I am really interested to try this author. This one probably is the book on this list though that I'm the most wary of, or most unsure of what I'm going to think of it, just because since buying it I have heard that this has incest in it, which is something that I tend to not like in books. It can sometimes like turn me off from a book, so I'm a little bit wary of it because of that, but I do still want to give it a try and still want to try this author. Next up, we have The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams. This is the first book in a trilogy that I think then has a companion trilogy to it. So if I get into this, there will be quite a few books to read. This is the beginning of the Memory, Sorrow, Thorn trilogy, and I have been hearing some really good things about this one. I've heard some really good things about the author's writing. This is another one though that I'm not as clear on what the plot is. I think it just seems like very standard fantasy, like go on a quest. There's like a band of people going on a quest. There's the League of the Scroll, and there's like a kitchen boy who is going on the quest with them. But I really want to try out this author and see if I like his work. And then the last book on this list is the one YA book that I have, which is Raybearer by Jordan Ifueko. I've been hearing incredible things about this book. I feel like everybody has been loving and raving about this book. So I really want to finally give it a try. And in this, our main character has been sent to compete to become one of the Crown Prince's Council of 11, which is essentially like his inner circle who are extremely loyal to him. But she also has had a wish laid upon her that compels her to try to kill the prince. And so if she becomes part of his inner circle, she will have this conflicting motives as to whether she should kill the prince or protect him. And this says that Raybearer is the story of loyalty, fate, and the lengths we're willing to go to for the ones we love. So I think it sounds really interesting. As I said, I've been hearing amazing things. I think the second book is coming out in 2021, so I'd like to try and get to this one kind of early in the year so that I can be excited about the new release. So those are my top 10 books to read in 2021. I am pretty excited about these. Hopefully it is a good reading year. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!